So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different than the presentations that you've heard thus far and the ones that you're going to hear later on today. Most of the presentations today are about really honing the retail instinct, doing what retailers do well, which is finding customers, merchandising to them, getting them to buy the things that you're selling. But mine's a little bit different. And to illustrate it, given that it's the lures of retail, I want to tell you my own fish story. And the fish story goes something like this. I have two 11-year-old daughters. They are into wildlife, and they are also into photography. So a couple of weeks ago, we were watching a National Geographic video, you know, the kind you can get on Netflix, 55 minutes, perfect right before you go to bed. And it was really about a National Geographic photographer. It was about how they create the images. Not the just, you know, great image after great image, but how did they get that great image, and what was the story behind that image? So we were going through the video, and at one point, they had a picture. It's a very famous photo. I'm sure you've all seen it. If I had it here, you would recognize it instantly, which is the grizzly bear somewhere in Alaska, standing at the top of the waterfall, mouth open, waiting for the fish to jump in. Working really hard at it, actually, although it looks like he's waiting, but he's moving all back and forth. And there's other grizzlies that are there doing the same thing. And they're working, and they're waiting for a long time for those fish to jump into their mouths. But then, of course, that's the photo as it ran. And then they step back and show you what was actually happening at the time. The video that didn't make it to the National Geographic episode or didn't make it into the magazine. And what was actually happening at the time? You had the bears standing at the top of the waterfall waiting for the fish to jump in their mouths. But then off to the side, you had the other grizzlies that were being fed from the park rangers that were jumping fish parts onto the riverbank. Now, the wisdom of feeding grizzlies fish parts from the truck I won't comment on, but what's the moral of the story? All the fish aren't necessarily in the river. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. So, with that, I'm going to make a bold prediction. My bold prediction is this, that for the brands that are in the room, retail and otherwise, about 50% of you are going to be behaving like digital media companies in the next 2 years. Specifically, rather than your instincts of looking for the fish and waiting at the top of the waterfall, maybe you'll find the park ranger hanging out the fish parts on the side of the bank. That's what I mean by maybe some things here aren't as what we've been doing for our career as retailers, but maybe we need to look a little further afield and think about some different opportunities. And one in particular is behaving like a digital media company. What I mean by that is that you'll be generating revenue from selling your audience, from allowing other advertisers to reach your audience. Now you might be wondering, who is this crazy guy telling us stories about grizzlies and how we're going to become digital media companies? But you know, the introduction with Jason notwithstanding, I founded a company called OwnerIQ in 2007. What we do is we help manufacturers and retailers take their audience and turn it into digital media opportunities. We use this concept called ownership targeting, which is taking consumer interaction with brands and products and allowing an advertiser to target on the basis of that information. So we've been working with brands for a while now and have quite a catbird seat in terms of what they're doing and how they're thinking about the audience that's coming to their web properties. And we've been doing that for a while, as I said, since 2007. But last year, in 2011, a major discontinuity happened in the marketplace. And what that was that Amazon, which didn't so much as announce as they let it leak, that they were going to be launching something called the Amazon Audience Network. Those are actually my words, my label, not necessarily theirs. But what they're going to be doing, or what they are doing now, I should say, is allowing advertisers to take consumers that go to Amazon, based on the behavior they have at Amazon, target those consumers with an advertising message. So we know Amazon for books, we know them for the Kindle, we may know them for Amazon Web Services, but we don't necessarily think of them as a media company, yet that's exactly what they've become. So now Amazon, as the 800-pound gorilla in retail, we know that whenever Amazon does something, every other retailer pays attention to it, and this was no different. So we've been talking to retailers and working with them for a while, and as soon as this happened, we start getting a tremendous amount of inbound interest. What is Amazon doing? What's the ramifications of that? How, as a retailer, should I be responding to that? And the momentum around this is now so significant that there are many retail brands that are focusing on this part of their business, which is taking their audience to their web properties and transforming it into digital ad revenue. Amazon is probably the most noteworthy example. Best Buy is doing it. Walmart is doing it. Some of the biggest brands in retail are engaged in this effort today. And what is Amazon actually doing? Well, we're all familiar with traditional online display advertising. This is an illustration of buying an ad on the property that's sponsoring the front of the podium here. And I'm sure all your media plans have included this at one time or another, which is just a regular old display ad. Pretty straightforward stuff. You're buying a publisher as a proxy for an audience that you're trying to reach. Certainly it's evolved a bit where now you can buy display advertising onto retail properties. So the retailer is carving off part of their real estate on their web property and making it available for advertisers to purchase. Now, typically the way this is used today is for the manufacturers and suppliers that sell through the retailer. They are using that space to promote sell-through in that particular channel. And that's pretty common in terms of what's happening today in terms of online monetization of your web property. But Amazon has taken it a step further. And what they've done is, based on your behavior on Amazon, they'll first collect data on you by dropping a cookie. So for example, if you go to the, look at a video game on Amazon, it'll tag you that way. If you go to look at a baby carriage, it'll tag you that way. They'll segment you into those various audience segments, whether it be the gamer segment or whether it be the new family segment, for example. And at this point, this is pretty familiar. Because if you're doing web personalization on your website, this is the process that you go through. Identifying consumers by how they come, segmenting them into audiences. The next step is where things get more interesting, which is what Amazon is doing now, is having segmented these consumers, allowing other advertisers to come in and put ads in front of them when these consumers leave Amazon and go to any other place around the web. So for example, somebody comes to Amazon, looks at a video game, and now we can put an ad in front of them elsewhere, ESPN, for example, from an energy drink or a new Hollywood release, any one of these other kinds of advertisers. And Amazon is effectively selling that opportunity as a behaviorally targeted audience network. Now, this technology that's doing this is obviously very similar to retargeting. It's enabled by all the developments that happened in ad tech over the last 4 or 5 years. The virtual alphabet soup of DMPs, DSPs, ad exchanges, real-time bidding, all of the things that I'm sure you've heard mentioned. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that technology. Suffice it to say, though, that over the last 4 years, this has now become possible, and it's become possible for brands to take the audience that's coming to their website and now enable other advertisers to buy into it. So why would Amazon want to do such a thing? Why would other brands want to do such a thing? And the answer for this is clearly the revenue. Revenue first and foremost. We all know from presentation earlier, and in fact I believe these are eMarketer numbers, that the online spend this year, 2012, around $39 to $40 billion. 2014 going up to over $50 billion in terms of spend. So there's huge aggregate demand, and the fastest growing portion of advertising is online and digital. And so it makes sense that given that demand, if a retailer has an opportunity to tap into it, they'd like to do so. But demand alone isn't enough. Why would somebody want to reach your brand? Why would somebody want to reach the audiences coming to your web properties? And there's really two answers to that. First, what I call the endemic. That is, think about, again, the suppliers and the manufacturers that put product on your shelves in your store. Those companies want to drive sell-through through your channel. Being able to reach the audience that's coming to your website, not only on your site, but off your site as well, in a retargeting capacity, so when they travel around, you can reach them again, is a pretty compelling opportunity for a manufacturer. We have clients that are adding this into their their portfolio of co-op or MDF opportunities that are available to manufacturers to be able to reach that audience. But in addition to that, and perhaps even more interestingly, is what I would call the non-endemics. So today, most retailers, although they do the co-op and the MDF, they do not have access to advertising budgets from other advertisers that are related, but are not necessarily sold through their store shelves. Best example of this is you can think of sort of luxury retail brands that potentially would be, luxury automotive manufacturers and other luxury manufacturers be interested in reaching the consumers that are going to those brands, but now don't have the opportunity to do so. And you think about it, when we think about the brands that we've built, we've all been in a conference room where we talked about our brand and defined it by the constellation of other brands that consumers are interacting with when they interact with our brand as well. So for example, like that's the Mac guy, or the person that buys the BMW also engages in these other types of brands. And so now you have an opportunity for non-endemics to say, gee, I would like to reach consumers going to that brand because our brands logically travel together. Think of the example on this slide, BMW and Tiffany. It's a logical association that if I was a marketer at either of those properties, the idea of being able to reach those brands would be a pretty attractive opportunity. Another reason why retail brands, and frankly all brands, thinking about generating digital ad revenue from their web visitors. And lastly, if those reasons weren't compelling enough, the final reason why this is so attractive right now to brands is the margin contribution. We all know what's happening in retail in terms of the products that move off the shelf. Margins are lower and challenged, and it's getting more and more challenging as time goes on. And if you think of the margin contribution from this, it's pretty significant. So in terms of the top line dollars that selling advertising can generate, it's meaningful, but for most retailers, it isn't going to change their lives. On the other hand, the margin contribution is spectacular, meaning that if for a small amount of income generated from ad revenue, it makes a huge amount of margin, and it equates to a lot of products that have to move off the shelf. This chart here says, $1 million in ad income. If you're sort of running in a 10% gross margin realm, you're looking at around $10 million in terms of total margin contribution, meaning you'd have to move $10 million in products to make the same amount that you're making off that $1 million in advertising that you've sold. And while that's good for margin contribution, it's even better from a shareholder perspective. As you know, most companies are evaluated in a price-to-earnings ratio. So when you look at the contribution that this kind of income can make in terms of shareholder value, it's very significant. Amazon, when I came in here, was trading at about 185 times price-to-earnings. So an additional $1 million in earnings translates into about $200 million additional market capitalization. Family Dollar, a less glamorous retailer, trading at about 20, and local retailer Staples trading at about 10. So for every $1 million in ad income, you're talking about an additional $10 million in shareholder value that's created as a result of doing this. So now you say, well, this is pretty interesting. As a retailer, gee, we'd like to do this. And the question I get asked is, well, how do you go about doing it? And the first step that has to happen is a very non-intuitive one. Very frequently we talk about paid media, which is pretty obvious. It's the media that you pay for, of course. Earned media, which is the media that you earn by doing cool things, PR and such things like that. And then there's owned media that we're all familiar with, signage on trucks, signage on stores, in-store, your website, these kinds of things. Yet the biggest owned media asset, certainly the biggest online owned media asset that a company has, and specifically that a retailer has, in terms of reach and frequency, is the audience that's coming to your website or your web properties and your ability to reach them after they leave your web property. It's the biggest online owned media asset that you have. And today, typically that owned media asset is actually not managed in the same way that any other owned media assets in the company are managed. To change signage on trucks, to change signage on stores, to change the website is typically done all the way in the CMO's office. It's a major marketing initiative. Look at how the audience that comes to your website after it leaves your website is managed today. Either potentially your agency is using it as part of your other display campaigns to improve performance there. You've perhaps hired a retargeter and given them exclusive access to it to drive bottom-of-the-funnel conversions. Or maybe you're not doing anything with it. The point is that audience needs to be managed in the same way that you manage your other owned media today and taken just as seriously. And with that mind shift, then you can start to think about, well, what are the revenue generating opportunities I have from the audience that I have coming to my properties? And when we talk about this, there's really then three questions that I usually end up discussing. One, how do I assess what the opportunity is? Two, what about competitors? I really don't want them being able to buy my audience. That would be a bad thing. And then lastly, what about the privacy? And no conversation would be complete without talking about that. So first off, in terms of the way we think about assessing the opportunity, two dimensions to it. Across the bottom one, we have what's called brand scale. Quite simply, this is how many people are coming to your web properties every month. How many consumers do you have to work with? On the vertical axis, it's brand strength, which is roughly correlates to how much brand equity do you have? Do people know your brand? Do they have an affinity for your brand? Do they identify with it? And within these two dimensions, you have essentially four quadrants, and it gives you kind of a rough idea think about what your opportunities might be. So in the upper right-hand side, the upper quadrant, which is the place up and to the right where everybody wants to be, you have high brand scale and high brand equity. These are the Walmarts, the Best Buys, the Amazons. The world is effectively their oyster. They have all sorts of opportunities, including running their own audience networks. If you're in the lower left quadrant, low strength, low scale, well, honestly, this probably isn't the opportunity for you at the moment. But the other two are very worthwhile in terms of talking about. In the upper left, high strength, low scale, we typically see this with luxury brands. You'll have luxury brands that have huge brand cachet, but relatively small amounts of traffic coming to their sites. What can they do? The answer there is that they can form sort of a small number of very high-value partnerships, where you have a few brands that have high affinity that are then partnering with your brand, and perhaps you partnering with them, either in a barter capacity or in an outright media buy capacity where other brands are buying access to your audience. In the lower right-hand corner, you have high brands. A lot of people come to your website, high brand scale, but relatively low equity. We see this in a lot of cases where you have a lot of online retailers. Online retailers that drive most of their traffic via search will have lots of flow-through. They will have lots of visitors coming to that site. But the brands may be comparatively unknown because they're done at a time of transaction. Here is an opportunity where that retailer can take that audience and make it available to other advertisers around the category that these people are shopping in. Not necessarily competitors, of course, but other affinity, other related advertisers. And there's a way that they can translate that, all that traffic that's coming to their website, in addition to the transactions they're taking off of it, translate it also into additional revenue that they can generate from other advertisers. Now, lastly would be the consumer privacy. And in the case of consumer privacy, I mean, the first thing to say about this is that ultimately every organization is going to have to go their own way on this. In the last few years, the industry has made quite a few strides in terms of dealing with consumer perceptions around this. Consistent notifications, ability to opt out, and in fact, even included in most of the advertising that's behaviorally targeted these days, as this advertising naturally would be, is the ad choices icon. So folks can even see that the ad was behaviorally targeted. So in many cases now, the consumer has complete visibility in terms of what's going on here. And in terms of thinking about it, we often say in retail, consumers vote with their feet. We've heard that saying a lot. And what's interesting about the privacy situation is that consumers vote with their feet because their silence is deafening, which is that they are actually not opting out. The opt-out rates are exceedingly low. The rates at which people even click on the ad choices icons to understand that the ads were behaviorally targeted, also extremely low. So in most cases, the consumers don't seem to be as animated about the privacy as potentially some others in the marketplace. So back to my bold prediction at the beginning, where I said that 50% of the brands in the room would be behaving like media companies. The truth is, it actually may not have been that bold after all. And the reason I say that is because there are plenty of examples today, as I've illustrated already, of companies that are already doing this, and many examples of other companies that are in the beginning stages of actually doing this. What we've done here is just rip from the headlines some of the brands that you're familiar with that are already looking at or already doing this type of activity, which leads to sort of an interesting turn of events that I think is going to be happening over the next few years, which is that right now, when you think about your media mix and you think about your media plan, it's these kinds of properties that are typically on that media plan, at least your digital media plan anyway. When you issue an IO, you're going to have maybe direct publisher buys, going to the New York Times, the Boston Globe, or you're going to have ad networks, for example, that aggregate publishers because they reach the audience that you want. And that's typically what a media buy looks like today. But if you fast forward a few years, media buys may start to look a little different. Instead of just focusing on those companies that exist to aggregate audiences, you may be able to buy directly against the brands that have aggregated audiences by virtue of the power of their brand. And retailers are one of the strongest brands, or some of the strongest brands out there. So you think about what that media plan may look like in the future, and it's your ability to potentially buy against these particular brands and others like them. And so at the end, you have to say, well, what's the role for my brand? Is my brand going to be one of these that's generating digital advertising revenue? Am I going to be participating in sort of buying the audiences of other brands? And that's really the question that you actually have to answer. And ultimately, the question is whether you're the grizzly looking for the opportunistic handouts or whether you're going to stick to your instincts and just fish for the fish in the river. So thank you very much.